We recently announced that the State of the Nation will be having its first live business breakfast in more than 2 years. On Tuesday, the 10th of May, we will be hosting Wayne Divinage from Outer. But we've got even better news, and that is that Wayne will be joined on stage with Ralph Mateja, the best political analyst in South Africa. So make a date, come and join us at the Tryst in Woodmead on Tuesday the 10th of May, where you will be able to enjoy breakfast and listen to the discussion around the State of the Nation between Wayne Divinage from Outer, Ralph Mateja, whose articles are on News 24 and many other political websites, and myself, Mike Sham. We hope to see you at our State of the Nation business breakfast. Welcome to the State of the Nation webinar. It's wonderful to have you with us, and in keeping with our mandate to bring you analysis of the topical events of the day, we thought that there were two issues that really needed some commentary. One is the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which has had devastating impacts on Eastern Europe and has taken one of the budding countries in Eastern Europe and returned it to rubble. This, of course, has had massive impacts on the global economy. We now could see food shortages, we're seeing power shortages in Europe, and all of these effects will filter their way down to little old us in South Africa. We are also having some devastating weather, most notably the floods in Kwa-Zulu Natal, but not only there, we've had rain for weeks in most parts of the country. So we thought that we would turn to one of our long-standing contributors, Mr. Clem Sunter. Hello, Clem. Welcome back to the State of the Nation. It's wonderful to have you here.
Yeah, I'd like to start by referring to a book that I wrote in 2015. It's called Flagwatching, How a Fox Decodes the Future. And I wrote it because I wanted to get across the point that a futurist is not a prophet. It's not a person who has this abnormal sense of what's going to happen in the future. A good futurist is a person who can spot those flags, which are events or even trends, which are changing the present into the future, and then examines the narratives which flow out of the flags. And probably one of the best examples of that I can give was that in the 1990s, it became very apparent that there was a growing confrontation between the major religions of the world, particularly Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And that, combined with the growing sophistication of tactics and weaponry for the terrorists themselves, it meant that the risks associated with a major event in the West, in a Western city, caused by terrorists, that risk had risen. And that's why in a book that I wrote with Chantal Ilbery in 2001, published in June, we said in a letter to George Bush, this is your biggest threat, a major terrorist strike on a Western city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. Now, the point of this is that we didn't actually give the date or how it would happen, because you can't do that kind of stuff. But what you can do is show that a flag is increasing the risk in certain areas of your life. And in flag watching, I devoted a very large part of the book. Sorry, I have to just pick up the text. I devoted a large part of the book to the Ukraine. This was back in 2015 because it had risen as a red flag. And I'd like to just quote you some of what I wrote in this book about this flag, because it shows the methodology, but it also shows how effective it can be. This is what I said. I said, the flag is an existential threat to the West, and it is very red. It is about Russia, or more specifically, Vladimir Putin, and it went up with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Is the voluntary return of Crimea a likely scenario? The answer is no. Already mission creep has slipped into Russian strategy in that they are assisting the Russian rebels in eastern Ukraine. In a sense, Ukraine is Russia's window on the West, as all the other former members of the Soviet Union on its western border, except Belarus, have joined the European Union and are members of NATO. If Ukraine were to do the same, it would just about complete Russia's loss on its western fronts. Hence, from a Russian perspective, the stakes are very high, and it is unlikely that it will go into reverse on its policy, whatever the economic cost of sanctions. For Americans, the current Ukrainian government is perfectly legal, and the Russians have invaded a sovereign state. So back in 2014, the invasion started. I then go on to say, that brings us to the ultimate scenario of a flat-out exchange of nuclear missiles between America and Russia. Putin continuously mentions the nuclear option these days in a way that leaves US diplomats experienced in Cold War politics scratching their heads in disbelief. One said the other day that America used to have a feel for Russian logic during the Cold War. Now they are totally mystified. They no longer know where nuclear weapons sit in Russia's order of battle, nor what would signal their imminent use. And I say this because recently Putin sent off a new intercontinental ballistic missile into space and basically said to the West, this offers you food for thought, because this missile can actually go further than any of yours. And so, you know, we are in this situation where we have this red flag, and we should then obviously examine what the consequences of the red flag could be. And so I went on in the book to say that what you have to look at is nuclear game theory, which is the sort of theoretical background to all nuclear wars that was first written up in a book by Herman Kahn, who was the original scenario planner back in 1960. He called it On Thermonuclear War. And he had painted a picture of the devastating impact that nuclear war could have if Russia and America ever came to blows. And indeed, 2 years later, they very nearly did over the Cuban Missile Crisis, because America felt that Russia was too close for comfort by planting missiles in Cuba aimed at American cities. And Kennedy and Khrushchev, you know, were in very intense conversations for two months, September and October 1962. At times, there could have easily been a launch of nuclear weapons by one side against the other. And out of this kind of confrontation came the principle of mutually assured destruction, which kind of stopped them both from launching their weapons, which was, if you nuke me, I'll nuke you, will both cause devastation to both our countries, and therefore it is not a sensible thing to do. So what I ask in this article and in the book, flag watching, is that principle of mutually assured destruction still valid? What I said was this: if John von Neumann, who was the originator of this expression, an American, well, he was an Austrian physicist and mathematician, were alive today, I would want him to ask the following questions. Maybe someone from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, when von Neumann was based, is sufficiently well versed in game theory to act as a substitute. And the questions are these, and they're vital, given what's the tension is between the two superpowers, which has never been like it was since 1962. These questions are very vital to the future of our world. Is MAD, mutually assured destruction, still a valid concept, which makes nuclear conflict highly improbable? Is the doomsday scenario widely accepted? Or do military strategists now play nuclear war games where they examine less apocalyptic sequels? If so, do they look at a conventional war preceding a nuclear exchange or the other way round? And then the second question, and remember, I asked this in 2015, what would be the estimated damage and loss of life caused by a nuclear conflict between the US and Europe on the one side and Russia on the other? What harm would be done to the environment in the short and the long term? Because of course, scientists are now saying that a nuclear war would cause nuclear winter, where the amount of dust in the atmosphere would create this, terrible situation where the sun would simply not be available to Earth for a very long time, and we'd go into a nuclear winter. The third question I ask is, what would be the impact on the rest of the world? And would the whole world recover from such a global war as quickly as it did in 1945? This is a valid question because at the moment, the war is restricted to Europe and the Ukraine and Russia and America, with everybody else looking on, but we live in the same world. And if you create a nuclear winter or problems with radiation spreading around the world, then that affects everybody. And how long would it go on affecting people? Because we did recover from the Second World War, but would we recover from a Third World War? And then obviously this question, again, put in 2015, what are the probabilities of the current game in Ukraine remaining localized or deteriorating into a direct military conflict between the major players with potential nuclear consequences? And then one last question, how does emotion feature in the mathematical models of game theory, since patriotism has as much as logic can be responsible for the onset of nuclear war? In other words, people talk of blind rage, and that's because rage blinds the mind. And if either Putin or Biden get consumed by blind rage, will they push the button? And how does game theory actually handle these things? And at the time I said that I hadn't come across a single word in the printed or social media, on television or radio or anywhere in the public domain addressing the issue. And the crazy thing is that in 2022, since the war started in February in Ukraine, you've seen very little mention of this incredible threat and how it is going to be handled. And I have to mention two people who have said that this war was pretty much inevitable because there was no give or take on either side. The first one was Henry Kissinger, who is still alive at the age of 96, but he wrote an article in 2014 about the Ukraine. And he said, you've got to come to a diplomatic solution now, rather than let it spin out. And he said the test of an agreement is not absolute satisfaction on either side, but balanced dissatisfaction. And that is a profound comment, because what we saw in February, before the Russians actually invaded, was America and Europe not listening at all to any of Russia's concerns about NATO being so close to the border. They basically just said, go away. And meanwhile, Russia in no way mitigated any of its requests. There was just no chat on either side to offer what Henry Kissinger called a kind of diplomatic agreement that balanced dissatisfaction on both sides. In other words, compromises would be made. And the other person who made a comment, and he made it in December last year, and he's still alive, is Mikhail Gorbachev, who was responsible for Glasnost and was responsible for the breakup of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he basically said in December that America had taken advantage of the weakness of the Soviet Union during the 1990s to push the whole NATO presence in Europe in a way that hadn't really been foreseen by Russia, and created this huge kind of anxiety in Russia. I often say, how would America feel if Canada had Russian soldiers, close to Vancouver, which is just over the border from Seattle? How would America respond to that? But you have American soldiers in Poland, which is right on the border of Russia and the Ukraine. So, it's something that could have been handled, but it's just so unfortunate that we're now in this dreadful war with terrible loss of civilian life. Mariupol, the city on the south coast, is now a total ruin, and it's going to be very, very difficult now to come to a diplomatic solution. But it is the reason why this article, which I called "On the Brink of World War III: The Questions to Ask," and went into those questions of the book in 2015, why they're so urgent to answer now, because we really, really don't want a nuclear war to happen as a result of the invasion of the Ukraine.
So, Clem, there's obviously been the question of there's some similarities but some differences between the world in the 1960s versus the world in the 2020s. Most notably, leaders like Khrushchev, Kennedy were themselves involved in the Second World War. They were both World War II veterans. They had seen what war looked like, right? Even though Joe Biden is as old as the hills, he's never been involved in a war. He's now joined. I love the fact that America has got a succession of presidents that were all draft dodgers, and he's yet another draft dodger. So between him and Trump and Clinton and George W. Bush, all these guys were draft dodgers. They never saw battle. And it's very easy to talk about war when I think perhaps the only place you've ever seen it is either at Hollywood or on PlayStation. Putin acts like a Mr. Tough guy, but he missed the glory years of the Cold War. So you've got a whole lot of people that are setting policy that don't know the ramification of their own policy. Now, if you're a student of history, you can look at the Second World War as just a continuation of the First World War. But in a way, this scenario at the moment looks very much like the beginning of World War I, where the people also thought it was ridiculous that there would ever be a war in Europe. and there were a whole lot of new technologies, and the public were dead against it. But the royal families at the time felt slighted by the world, and they decided that they were going to let their people die. But people were unhappy, and there was very little they could do about it. Now we have a situation at the moment where, are we talking about a position taken by the Russian majority or by Vladimir Putin? You know, much like, was it Germany's will to go back to war, or was it just Adolf Hitler? Would Germany have gone to war without him? Will Russia go to war without Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, look, one of the points that I make at the very end of the article, it wasn't in Flagwatching, but in the article I wrote the other day on this book, Flagwatching, I said, the stark reality of war is that most strategic decisions are made by the leaders themselves and nobody else. In this case, Putin and Biden. It would be a tragedy for the rest of humankind if, as a pair, they stumbled into nuclear war when there were other alternatives available. In other words, you're absolutely right to ask that question, because you know, a lot of other problems are handled by referendums or seeking advice from lots of different people, and then a consensus is arrived at, and you then make a decision and move forward. In war, it becomes very personal between the leaders of the two, the two nations going to war. And in this case, Biden and Putin, who you correctly say, were never involved in a world war like those leaders were in 1960. And the other point you made, which was absolutely right, was that essentially the Second World War was different to the First World War. Nobody had a clue. They thought that the 1914, when the war started, it would end by Christmas, and it didn't. It went on for 4 or 5 years, and there are lots of people, you know, right now talking about day 56 or day 60 or whatever it is of the Ukraine war, as though this is going to be over in a few months. This war could go on for 5 years. I mean, in a sense, as I said in Flagwatching, it started in 2014. This could drag on. But obviously, if it ends in a nuclear war, that would be very different and probably be quite short. But the one thing the Americans learned after the Second World War was that you shouldn't create the conditions for war, which the Versailles Treaty after the First World War created by putting so many onerous conditions on the German economy, which led to its collapse into the mid-late 20s, which led to the rise of Hitler and the militarization of Germany and the Second World War. I mean, in this case, we don't have the strategy that was adopted after the Second World War, which was Marshall Aid, which was to help Germany revive so that you didn't have another repeat of the Second World War. What's happening now is that you have sanctions against Russia, which I don't see being lifted at any time in the near future. We know that the Ukrainian economy has been wrecked by the war. It's only half, apparently, the size of what it was. But the Russian economy is also going to suffer too, as these sanctions really hit. And then you have to play scenarios as to whether this will make somebody like Putin more desperate, and then, more willing to use extreme weapons, or whether, as a result of sanctions, Russia will come to the table. But yeah, it all comes down to the leaders. And I think the one thing which has been said in the press everywhere is that right now, the Russian leader is highly unpredictable. And that's why you have to consider all the scenarios.
Clem, there's another interesting scenario that's busy playing out. I feel that doesn't get enough commentary, and that is, in a sense, you've got a 20th century leader in Putin, the strong man, the guy who walks into the room alone, all these generals quaking in their boots, fighting against a 21st century leader in Zelensky, a guy who's on the ground using social media. On the one hand, there's no information. On the other hand, there's all the information you could ever want. I mean, Zelensky's on TV all the time. So, do you think that's going to play a role in the outcome of, could this see, much like, I keep on going back to it, the First World War saw the end of monarchies because the kings were so out of touch. To me, what we are starting to see is we're starting to see leaders of a certain generation stuck in the 20th century, unable to cope with the modern world, i.e. Putin, and to an extent Biden. But yet Zelensky showing himself to be what leaders of the future may look like. A bit more tech savvy, a bit more understanding that it's very hard to make your people just line up in a big line and attack the enemy and die, and you just send letters to their mothers. I don't think those situation exists anymore. May become easier just to press that button, but do you think there's a flag that needs to watch just purely over the leadership and whether they're in touch with the modern world or not?
Absolutely, and I think you've made an excellent point, Mike. Zelensky is every bit a 21st century media capable of using modern social media to create momentum. And the way he's addressed all the national parliaments around the world has been superb. And the way he's gone from being an entertainer to being a leader is incredible. And as one general said, when you're on the ground in a war, one of the most important qualities that an army has to have is the will to win. And, Zelensky has really intensified that will. And that's why the first phase of the war around Kiev, the Russians basically lost, is they just didn't have that kind of motivation that the Ukrainians have. And part of that motivation comes from having a leader who's, absolutely based in the 21st century. And one has to say, Ukraine is a democracy which has more freedom. And quite a few people have remarked that, the Ukrainian army is much better prepared for modern warfare because at the level of non-commissioned officer, not at the level of general, but at non-commissioned officer level, there's a lot of strategization which is done in combination with the leaders at the top, and which then leads to being a fox when it comes to adapting strategy on the ground, because they have a much better feel for the situation, and they have the support of their troops. Whereas a lot of people have said that the Russian army has been caught in the 20th century of very much command and control at the top, but you don't have those kind of leaders in the non-commissioned officer ranks that can actually make smart decisions on the ground in line with the overall strategy, but which can surprise the enemy and possibly win a local battle. So yes, Zelensky has made a huge difference by being a leader of the 21st century.
I suppose time will tell whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that Ukraine has put up such a stout defense, because a stout defense and even setbacks to Russia could probably bring Putin closer to pressing the button.
That's why I've written all this stuff. And I mean, some people will probably say it's still unthinkable. And, to move from where we are to a full-scale nuclear exchange between America and Russia is still impossible, because it would mean ruin on both sides. But, that's why I ask those questions, is that I want to see a dialogue in the media and on TV by people who really understand the nuclear game, so that it's in your face that it has to be avoided. just like, in a sense, Herman Kahn's book on thermonuclear war in 1960. It apparently was read by several of the American leading strategists. So it kind of featured in the conversation. I just don't, as I said in the article, want these two leaders to stumble into a war because, as you rightly say, Ukraine puts up such a stout resistance that it becomes a stalemate. And of course, the longer the stalemate lasts, the more economic misery Russia will suffer, and that will lead to anger. It could lead to a change of leadership. You could have another Gorbachev or Yeltsin coming in who would be prepared to negotiate a diplomatic solution. But it could also lead to, Putin becoming more desperate, or a successor to Putin who's even more conservative. It just raises the risk. It raises the unpredictability to have the Russian economy going into, a big fall. So, all these things have to be thought through. But I'm not for one moment saying we shouldn't admire the incredible resistance and resilience of the Ukrainian army, which I have to say, is not as well armed as the Russian army. They're now fighting on the east, where there's much more logistical problems of supply from the west. In Mariupol, they've been talking for some time of running out of ammunition and stuff like that. So there's still a lot to be a lot to be analyzed in terms of where this future war can lead. And I have to say, on the other side, one of the points being made is that Russian tanks and guided missiles have components that come from the West, and therefore their production of arms has been dramatically reduced by the war and the sanctions. And so what I'm really saying is, yes, this could all lead to a diplomatic solution, but equally it could lead to a really desperate situation of a nuclear conflict. And that's why we should be open with all these scenarios.
Now, Clem, before we change tack, I just want to ask you, because I know it's something else you've looked at in the past, and that is, there is a similar standoff, similar but slightly different, between China and Taiwan, right? And now, there is no doubt that in the hallowed halls of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they would have had long discussions about whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine gives them the will to invade Taiwan. There is also the other school of thought saying that if they're going to do that invasion, don't think that Taiwan isn't going to have this big arms supply from the rest of the world, and talk about it may not be mutually assured destruction, but it's going to be very harmful for a country like China that is more interconnected with the world than Russia was. Russia's connection was largely on the energy front, and to a small degree agriculture. It's not like China, which supplies everything from the cameras and computers that we are busy talking to the cell phones in our pockets. That cuts both ways. On the one hand, we may not get the toys, but on the other hand, China won't get the business. And this could lead to absolute disaster for China. Do you think this has moved the needle in China at all? Do you think it raises the temperature, lowers the temperature, or both?
Okay, well, let's just, before we get on to China, look at America and Europe in this war. I draw a big distinction between the two in terms of the near-term to medium-term economic consequences of the war. America, and I said this in Flagwatching in 2015, America is not really hit in any way but by the war in Ukraine. It's energy self-sufficient. 90% of the American economy is local transactions. Only 10% of GDP is exported. And so, that's why the Dow Jones Industrial Average is sitting at record highs at the moment. It's because that they feel they're coming out of the pandemic. What goes on in Europe is really irrelevant for the American economy. And so one has to draw a distinction between America, which is also a fairly young, resilient population. It's where all the big tech ideas have come out over the last 20 to 30 years. There's not been a single European company like Twitter or Facebook or Apple or anything like that. The American economy is starting to really hum again. Europe, on the other hand, is really stuck now because it's an aging population. You can already see that there are differences of opinions. I know they talk about that NATO is walking in step with one another, all the countries, but actually, there are differences in approach in Europe, and so a lot of interdependence between the Russian and the European economy means that Europe is actually not going to do well over the next 5 years. It's going to have high inflation and low economic growth. And of course, what's going to add to the tension is if Finland and Sweden join NATO, because the Russians have already said they'll start moving missiles up to the north to face these countries down. So, that is another red flag because the Russians have made it very clear they want Finland and Sweden to remain neutral. But there does seem to be a switch in public opinion in both those countries. So in the kind of next 5 years, you have to draw a difference between American economic prospects and European economic prospects if there is a stalemate. We're not talking about a nuclear war scenario in this case. China, you're quite right, is also dependent on the American market. It has a sort of similar level percentage of exports as Europe. I mean, most European countries export 25% of their GDP to other European countries, but equally to the rest of the world. And China's the same. It's very dependent on the American economy. And in that sense, China has been very neutral in terms of what's going on between Ukraine and Russia. They don't want to get involved because they certainly don't want sanctions to be applied to themselves. And on the other hand, Russia has been a long-term ally. They share a border with Russia. And so, they don't want to anger Russia at the same time. So my view at the moment is that China is less willing at the moment to make military moves on Taiwan than they were, say, 3 or 4 months ago. Because what they're watching is Europe, as I said, being weakened by this war. And yes, America is still growing. And that's good for China because they export so much, so many goods to America. In fact, they're the only country in the world that competes with America in high tech and, moving into, artificial intelligence. It's the Chinese who are doing this. So yes, they do consider Taiwan as part of the original mainland China, but I feel that they don't want to trigger another war right now because they certainly don't want to suffer the same consequences as Russia in terms of economic sanctions. But it doesn't mean that sort of tension around the eventual sort of movement of Taiwan and its status and becoming part of China, that hasn't gone away. but I just don't see them right at this moment saying, well, because everybody's attention is turned on to Ukraine, we must have a go at Taiwan. Because, as you say, China is very dependent on sending exports to America, and they don't want to start being sanctioned.
Now, Clem, while we're on the topic of artificial intelligence, let's talk about South Africa and what we've experienced over the last while, and that is extreme weather conditions. Now, I know that that is something that you have been probably at the leading edge of, is talking about the implication of climate change and what we can expect from what we've done to the planet. Just briefly, give us your view of, or is this just an I told you so moment? Obviously, loss of life, really bad stuff happening in parts of our country.
It's absolutely terrible what has happened in Kwa-Zulu Natal, and but it's not just there. It's in Australia, it's in America. What you're seeing is extreme weather conditions, and it's more frequent these days, with extreme rainfall, extreme drought, extreme typhoons. I mean, there was a hurricane or typhoon in December in Kentucky that destroyed a whole small town in December. That's very unusual in America. There's drought, which is causing a lot of alarm in Spain and Portugal, in the center of those two countries, because they haven't had rain for a long time. You've seen these massive fires on both the east coast and west coast of Australia, but then followed by enormous rainfall, which has washed away a lot of the topsoil. It was amazing that in Vancouver, in July last year, that they experienced a temperature of 50 degrees centigrade. I mean, that's unheard of, really, in Australia or Africa or anywhere else. But they had, it was close on the eastern side of Vancouver, a temperature of 50 degrees. But that was then followed by incredible rain later on in the year, which has washed away a lot of the arable land north of Vancouver. So, it's something that the world is having to get used to, apart from the gradual rising of sea levels, which is putting coastal cities at risk. And it's a flag that I talked about in Flagwatching. It's the green flag. And the terrible thing about wars like the Ukraine is that everybody just completely forgets about climate change and what we have to do working as a team to overcome these problems and cut back on fossil fuel consumption and carbon emissions. That goes out of the window when it's kind of human beings versus human beings in a conflict. And as a historian that I often quote, a British historian of the last century called Dame Veronica Wedgwood, she said that conflict is the essence of history, that we as a species, we just go on and on and on indulging in conflict. So it's just hard to imagine the level of cooperation that we need in order to overcome this problem that is leading to the terrible tragedies in Kwa-Zulu Natal and elsewhere in the world. Because it will require a level of team spirit, which is certainly not apparent in the world at the moment.
Well, Clem, I did like one of the things that was mentioned early on in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that was, with the problem of Europe being very dependent on Russian energy, that perhaps this is the moment that the world gets together to have a Manhattan Project, a kind of organizational, well-funded plan to get the world off fossil fuels for once and for all, and not bits and pieces that could take another 50 years. But let's hope that that's in the future. Clem, you've been very generous with your time. Your insights are great. I got a feeling that you should speak to your publishers, because Flagwatching could get a little bit of interest back at the old bookstore again. Clem, thank you so much once again. It was lovely to speak to you. Thank you to everybody who joined us this morning for our State of the Nation webinar. Just a reminder that we are going to be doing our first live State of the Nation breakfast on Tuesday the 10th of May with Wayne Divenage from Outer and Ralph Mateja, one of the best political analysts in South Africa, as we speak about corruption, we speak about elections that are happening later in the year, that's the ANC elections, and the state of this nation. So if you haven't booked, there'll be a link for you to book. But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you at our next State of the Nation event. Thank you so much, and thank you to Clem Sunter. On Tuesday, the 10th of May, we will be hosting Wayne Divenage from Outer. But we've got even better news, and that is that Wayne will be joined on stage with Ralph Mateja, the best political analyst in South Africa. So make a date, come and join us at the Tryst in Woodmead on Tuesday, the 10th of May, where you will be able to enjoy breakfast and listen to the discussion around the State of the Nation between Wayne Divenage from Outer, Ralph Mateja, whose articles are on News 24 and many other political websites, and myself, Mike Sham. We hope to see you at our State of the Nation business breakfast.